In the previous chapters, we've drawn a parallel, or at least attempted to, between mysticism and science. In the first, we learned about Xenophanes, and how the characteristically Western scientific tradition traces a great deal of its doctrines from his philosophy. His combining of God and the universe and depriving God of his anthropomorphic features, converting him, as a result, into a principles, thereby a foundational stage in what was to come. In Chapter 2, we went on to challenge the common belief that science and philosophy are different, resorting to the school of Pythagoras to demonstrate the inseparability of the two, and to show that science was simply their means of approaching the mystical, noting that philosophy, as we understand it, or as the ancient Greeks understood it, arose from certain religious beliefs and creeds that predate the age of philosophy, particularly the strain of the Greek mythic tradition known as Orphism, and philosophers of Orphic roots are distinguishable, as Cornford notes, by their tendency to start schools wherein members are bound by a common code of brotherhood, and a set of esoteric beliefs usually unproclaimed to the public. In From Religion to Philosophy, Cornford finds himself tempted to draw a definitive line between philosophy and religion at the Milesian school of Thales. We also find in that discussion that the same attitude which drove philosophy and science apart is precisely that which he himself applies to separate religion from philosophy. The title itself presupposes a fundamental difference, making a separation, however artificial it is eventually bound to be, the object of the book. And the quest proves problematic on two accounts. The fact that it ascribes to the terms religion and philosophy a sort of finality and exactitude that one would think carries an objective value that is real and timeless. The second is very much in tune with those of philosophy and science, that it reduces things into dualities, or dichotomies, in this case, religion being distinct from philosophy and vice versa. As historian Arnold J. Toynbee observes, in any age of any society, the study of history, like other social activities, is governed by the dominant tendencies of the time and place, and from this perspective the tendency to label, categorize, and establish conceptual lines and create discontinuity between different disciplines of thought, and which might lead an otherwise disinterested historian to approach history as a factory whose events are the raw material and inventory that's to be prepared for the production of a specific product, pushing the industrially minded academic to seek differences and distinctions, individuate, single out, and lay siege down upon phenomena, designate and isolate them, all of which carried out in the spirit of truth. And for this, it serves the spirit of our analogy to include a passage by Bertrand Russell. Modern definitions of truth, such as those of pragmatism and instrumentalism, which are practical rather than contemplative, are inspired by industrialism as opposed to aristocracy. For the modern historian or researcher who's being directed by the general spirit and psychology of his age, i.e. industrialism, the truth, roughly speaking, is whatever the process may produce. Prejudicial off the gate, he approaches history with a clear idea of what he wants. He has all the inventory in the world, and in much the same vein as the industrial worker, the historian or academic is a miner, a scavenger, and even a detractor of anything which seeks, in one way or another, to threaten the envisioned outcome of the operation. He has a mechanism by which to identify useful and non-useful material. He codifies certain difficult phenomena, gathers them, then proceeds to compartmentalize them. In short, he exacts a strategy of divide and conquer upon not human beings this time, but history, intellect, and the world of the abstract. And it is not at all far-fetched to say that the scramble for Africa and the Sykes-Picot policies are merely the other side of it. That being said, this attitude is reproduced in the methodical separation of philosophy and science, and in turn, religion and philosophy. Industrialism, says Toynbee, is the application of modern Western scientific thought to the physical environment of human life. The application onto nature herself of that which a philosopher like Pythagoras would have considered only instrumental to mysticism, and man assuming an active role in the outcome of his ambient environment, marks his departure from the contemplative life, and the emergence of man as a creative entity, an operator, a participant in that Olympic theater. Man the participant, man the practical, takes his place in academia first in ancient Greece as a sophist. Unlike our typical philosopher, like Plato and Aristotle, the classical sophist isn't a contemplator. In ancient Greece, a sophist was a man that made his living by teaching things that were considered useful and practical. The term sophist in those times wasn't disparaging as one would think. It was merely the ancient equivalent of today's professor, a person who teaches and is materially rewarded for doing so, whereas a typical philosopher does his philosophy free of charge, in solitary settings or amongst a select group of like-minded thinkers. The problem with sophists is that they only taught those with private means, those who could afford to be taught. And that naturally entailed a sort of class bias, forcing them to be, in modern terms, politically correct and prudent in not promoting ideas that might upset or offend future clients. Whereas a typical philosopher might teach metaphysics, a sophist would teach the art of rhetoric, for instance. As is known, the sophists were especially unpopular with Plato, who, in the Republic, had the following to say about them. All those individuals who make their living by teaching and whom the public call sophists and envy their skills, in fact teach nothing but the conventional views held and expressed by the mass of people when they meet, and this they call a science. Evidently, the object of philosophy wasn't, to someone like Plato, as it was to Pythagoras, worldly objects, as there's nothing objective about the world, or opinions for that matter, which Plato saw as an intermediary stage between objective truths and falsehoods. In another passage, Plato chastises a sophist for being sycophantic and even downright oppressive. The punishments, disenfranchisement, fines, or death which those educational experts inflict on those who won't listen to them, imposing sanctions where persuasion has failed. Sophistry is concerned with value and practicality, philosophy and grand truths, which is why they often detested the rule of the senses and sought explanations that specifically transcended them. And that's why mathematics gained such importance amongst the philosophers, and notoriety, according to Aristotle, amongst the sophists. Sophistry is no less interested in the world. However, they didn't possess the intellectual freedom that the philosophers had, as the nature of their business pressured them into conformity. A philosopher's advantage was his detachment from the public. Their ascetic ways allowed them to philosophize with greater honesty than the classical sophist, as they weren't expecting to be rewarded. As Plato said, in speaking of the ideal philosopher, so when the current of a man's desire flows towards the acquisition of knowledge and similar activities, his pleasure will be in things purely of the mind, and physical pleasures will pass him by, that is, if he's a genuine philosopher, not a sham. Plato is highly polemical of the sophists, mainly on account of their pandering to the crowd and making the public their masters. He follows that if a person seeking knowledge keeps such company and submits his poems and other productions or his public services, he's going out of his way to make the public his master, and to subject himself to the fatal necessity of producing only what approves. Though the modern academic in his paradigm has more in common with the sophist, or is a sophist by Plato's standards, the philosopher is the one from whom the Western scientific tradition stems. The scientific tradition as we know it descends from that Pythagorean, Platonic, and Aristotelian strain of Greek thought, not from the sophists, as shown with Aristotle's intellectual supremacy in the matters of cosmology and logic that held sway up to the Middle Ages, and Plato's supremacy in matters of metaphysics, theosophy, and ethics, not to mention the fact that modern scientific doctrines believed to be the product of recent discoveries are actually rooted in and deduced from the doctrines of those ancient philosophers, like evolution, the seed for which can be found in Aristotle's principles of continuity and gradation codified in his zoology corpus. From Plato, on the other hand, is derived profound metaphysical concepts such as infinity and the subsistence of infinite forms and varieties. Ideas, though aren't originally Plato's, survived through him. As Whitehead put it, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Historian and analyst Arthur Lovejoy more efficiently highlights the genealogical character of this tradition in his work The Great Chain of Being, where he says, in a cosmography that by the end of the 18th century had come to be commonly held among educated men, the features which differentiated the new from the old world picture owed their introduction and, for the most part, their eventual general acceptance not to the actual discoveries or technical reasonings of astronomers, but to the influence of those originally Platonistic metaphysical preconceptions. Where the modern scientist and his Greek ancestor diverge is at the contemplative aspect of philosophy. In fact, it is in the modern scientist that both the philosopher and the sophist weirdly converge. A philosopher in that he's the heir of a long-standing philosophical tradition, a sophist in that he uses it, not to contemplate the beyond and the eternal, but to apply it onto nature. As historian Francis Yates writes, the Greeks, with their first-class mathematical and scientific brains, made many discoveries in mechanics and other applied sciences, but they never took wholeheartedly, with all their power, the momentous step which Western man took in the beginning of the modern period of crossing the bridge between the theoretical and the practical, of going all out to apply knowledge, to produce operations, and in asking why hadn't the Greeks done what the Western man succeeded to do. Though he had the knowledge and understanding of mechanics and mathematics, and the acumen to build complex judicial and political systems, she answers, it was basically a matter of will. This is the same question we encounter in Carl Jung's The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man. The Romans were familiar with all the mechanical principles and physical facts on the basis of which they could have constructed the steam engine, but all that came from it was a toy made by the hero of Alexandria. And in asking why, Jung, unlike Yeats, answers, there was no urgent necessity to go further. In other words, there was no incentive, which is not the same as will. On a closer look, not only are both answers valid, but they complement each other. Francis Yates adds that the Greeks did not want to operate. They regarded operations as base and mechanical, a degeneration from the only occupation worthy of the dignity of man, that is, pure rational and philosophical speculation. The division of philosophy and religion, and in turn science and philosophy, is ultimately artificial, as it is demonstrably the case that the most celebrated scientific ideas and theories derive their most basic axioms from doctrines developed by purely speculative philosophers, like the atomists, the Aristotelians, and the Neoplatonist traditions. It is also demonstrably the case that classical philosophy comes from religion, Orphism, and the introduction of Egyptian and Near Eastern religious influences into Greece by Thales of Miletus, and the fact that lots of Greek thinkers had traveled abroad to acquire knowledge, specifically Egypt, at the time the cradle of art and science.